But we're going to do something a little bit different today for Mother's Day. We're actually going to talk about grief. And you might say, well, why are we going to talk about grief on Mother's Day? This is supposed to be a happy day. And we're going to talk about grief because moms, you know what it's like to grieve. See, you grieved when your kids got their first scrape. And then they got that first boo-boo, and they grieved, and you grieved right alongside them. You grieved as your children grow up and they hit those different milestones. As they move on from kindergarten to first grade, and then they move out of their elementary school. You grieve as those different milestones come up. If you're a mom of teenagers, you are going to grieve some of the decisions that your students make. There's just a reality to that. And you will grieve as your children become more independent and less dependent on you. And then there are going to be times where you have to grieve alongside your child because maybe they went through a breakup or something difficult. And unfortunately, moms, some of you are going to have to grieve some things that are incredibly difficult that your children have gone through or been affected by. But what about the rest of us? It's not just moms that grieve, right? It's all of us. We all have different seasons of grief. And if I'm completely honest, my family, Lindsay and I and our kids, we've gone through a time of tremendous grief this past fall into this winter, and it's something that we're still working through to this day. But as we come into our teaching series for today, What Lies Beneath, we want to take a look at what it is that grief does inside of us underneath, so that way it comes out to the surface in the way that it should. See, we want to take a look at how do we handle our grief well? How do we grieve well? So that way what becomes of us isn't someone who's rigid and grumpy and miserable, but we can really see what God has for us. See, what we're going to see is that God has treasures in the midst of our grief. Each and every one of us. And if we can grieve well, we will see that God has treasures in store for us. And I told you that this is something I'm still working through. It's something my family is still working through. And so we thought it would be fit for someone who has a little more experience in this to share this morning. And so I'm going to invite up Gail Cooper. And Gail and her husband Kevin went through some grief that most of us cannot fathom. When they lost their son, Aaron, when he was 21 years old, to a tragic whitewater rafting accident. And Gail has gone through this grief. She's gone through this point in her life where things were just so overwhelming and so traumatic. But Gail was able to come through it. And Kevin was able to come through it and see the treasures that God had for them in the midst of their grief. And so I'm going to hand it over to Gail from here. And will you guys welcome Gail Cooper.
I got a phone call from Pastor Gadori. He is the founding pastor of this church one day. And he was telling me about the summer youth trip that was happening in Washington, D.C. And he said to me, Gail, all the kids were getting ready to go to a new destination. They hopped on the subway, every single one of them. And when they got there, every single one of them got off the subway. All of them except your son. When I tell you, my heart was beating out of my chest. And I said to Pastor, you mean to tell me that my 15-year-old son is on a subway with who knows who, going who knows where? I couldn't fathom it. All the scenarios kept going through my mind. Let me tell you, fear rose up inside of me. You see, none of us ever want to get phone calls like that. But we will, because God says in this world you will have trouble. But I'm here to tell you that God's sole purpose in the pain and in the troubles and the sorrows that we face, the sole purpose in all of that is to draw us closer to Him. And that is why He gave us kids. Okay, that was supposed to go over a little bit better than that because Justin laughed at it the other day. But it is so true. It's so true. You know, a few years later after that, I got another phone call. And, It was from a counselor, and many of you here know this story, but it was from a counselor at Liberty University. And he said to me, he said, Gail, he said, I don't know how to tell you this other than to just say it. He said, your son, Aaron, who was going to school there at the time, he was rafting with a friend, and they were going down the James River. And Gail, Aaron's raft flipped over, and he never came back up. Let me tell you that is the deepest, darkest hurt that I have ever felt in my entire life, and hopefully it will be the deepest, darkest hurt that I ever feel. But I'm here to tell you today that it was in all of my grief, in all of my sorrow, that not once did I feel the absence of God in my life. He was always there with me. But it was in the darkness, and it was in all that sorrow and the days that I couldn't see what was up ahead, that God was unearthing in me some of the greatest treasures that I would ever receive. And that's what God has for us in the darkness and the grief and in the sorrow. And that baby is beautiful. It's okay that she's doing that, and we love that. Happy Mother's Day, Mama. You see, that was God's job. That was his promise to me, that he would give me something in the trials, because that's what he does. So yes, that was his job, but mine was to simply surrender it all to God at that point in my life. You see, most of us here know that we can't get a do-over for what's already done, but we do have a choice in how we will respond to it. Listen, James 1:2 says this, and this is my first time with this, so I am going to try this, and here we go. It says this. It says, consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you fall, whenever you face trials of many kind. I love this verse because what God is saying to us is that to consider what you're going through, looking at it through the eyes of Christ. You see, God is right here in this verse. He's telling us to take action. He's not just saying to us, listen, if you get a moment, just think about it. But this is a command that he gives us in his word to take action, that when we are in the despair and in the darkness, he's saying that you don't have to stay there. There is something that you can do about it. Go to the light, look to the light. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters. And the next verse says this. Okay, that goes fast. It says, because you know that the testing of your faith produces something in us that we could never acquire on our own. And what that is it's perseverance. You see, it's in the darkest days of my life that I learned this gift, this treasure that was unearthed. For me, it was the ability to be able to stand strong. It was the ability to stay the course when everything in me wanted to quit, wanted to give up. On those darkest days when I did not want to get out of bed, God just nudged me up and said, just get up and just do it. Just look to me. And in all that, in the darkness, I learned how to persevere, how to stand up when I wanted to fall, to stay the course, to stand the ground in those seasons of struggle. And I know here, for some of you, that might be when the marriage is on edge, or the money runs out, or you yourself get a phone call that you really do not want to listen to. Next verse that God has for us is this. It's let perseverance finish its work in you so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. You see, God's greatest gift for us is that we become these giants in Christ, that when the weight of the world comes upon us, we're not going to crumble. We're not going to fall into this deep darkness of depression and despair, but that God is working something out in us. This should be our desire for all of us is, God, I may not understand what's going on. I may not even enjoy it one bit or like it, but God, I know that even in it, that you're working something out in me. And so God, every day, when I don't want to get out of bed, and I can't feel you, and I can't see you, I'm just going to put that one foot on the floor, God, and I'm going to trust you with that day. You see, the problem that we all face here is that we feel that we can grow in spiritual maturity without ever having to learn how to suffer God's way. Anybody with that? You see, in our seasons of grief, that's when God does some of his most incredible work in us, achieving in us goals that we never, ever would be able to acquire on our own. You see, what James is asking us to do here is just to rejoice in difficulty. And that is really hard because life is hard. We don't want to rejoice in the difficulty, but that's what God commands us to do because in it, he's producing something that honestly we need today. I mean, look around. This is not the garden, that Adam and Eve lived in. I mean, if you just turn on the news and you see everything going on, moms, I know some of us, sending our kids to school is really difficult. But God says life is going to be hard, but just to trust me in it. We're going to take a look today at the life of Bartimaeus. And any of you, I just love this story of Bart, it's so encouraging. And when I look at the story of Bartimaeus, what I see is this guy, Bartimaeus was blind. Some of you know this story. And every day he would go to the gate right outside of Jericho, and he would sit there. And he had to beg every day for his food, for money. People would go by and he would just say, please just have mercy on me. I need a few coins to be able to get through the day. His life was not one any of us would ever choose, but it was what he was born into. And a lot of people, they looked at Bartimaeus and they just, they thought of him as a burden. They thought of him as someone who just, was a pain. Every day you'd walk by and think of people when you walk in and you see people on the street corners, you get to the red light and you're like, oh, I know they're going to come up and they're going to ask for money, and that's great. Whatever you do, we have a heart for those people. But Bartimaeus, every day, he wouldn't have been able to get by unless it was for the mercy of others. But in Bartimaeus' darkness, in the depths of despair, he heard all when the comings and goings, and people were talking about Jesus, and they were talking about everything that they seen Jesus do, or what they heard that Jesus done, how he healed people, and they just thought it was great and it was really cool. And Bartimaeus is, he's taking this all in, and he's trying to listen, and he's hearing all these things that God did, and as he's listening, his heart is being turned towards God, because it's in the darkness that God exposes himself to us. You see, Bartimaeus, he may have been blind, but his vision was greater than what any healthy human eye could ever see. What he saw in that darkness was the miracles that he heard people throughout the years say as they were coming back from Jerusalem or wherever they were. And Bartimaeus is replaying all of this in his mind. And when he heard the story about, the paralytic, all of a sudden Bartimaeus is just sitting there in the darkness, and he's like, I can just see this person. He's like, all of a sudden, this is a man that could never walk, but now he's jumping for joy, and he's skipping, and Bartimaeus is playing all of this through his mind, and then he sees, in his mind a mom, and she's crying, and it's uncontrollable tears. But they're not tears of sadness, but they are tears of joy because Jesus raised her son from the dead. And as Bartimaeus is playing all of this through his mind, he understands who Jesus is. He comes to know him as Lord. And one day now we're talking about Bartimaeus, and all of a sudden this crowd starts coming into Jerusalem. And he hears all the ruckus because it's a multitude of people. There's many, many, many people here. And he's like, hey, what's going on? What's going on? And nobody really wanted to give him the time of day, right? So he said, what's going on? And Bartimaeus finally finds out that it's Jesus, and he's coming into town. And Bartimaeus is so blown away. All of a sudden, he's like, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And David is, okay, let's read back this up here. But he had come, what I really love is that he had come to know Jesus as Lord, not in the light, but in the darkness. And I think for us, that's when we draw closer to God. I know for me in my trials, when I saw God work in miraculous ways in my life and how he filled me with peace that surpasses all understanding, I was just blown away by his mercy. And so here he is, he's crying out to God, and he's saying, please have mercy on me. Have mercy on me, Lord. And the people there, on the side of him, they were rebuking him. And they said, listen, bud, you need to shut up. You just need to calm down. You see, the word for rebuke doesn't mean just, shh, can you be quiet? Jesus is coming. But it's pretty much like, listen, bud, it's a strong, strong word against him. They're admonishing him. And it's a strong admonish. And this is to the point where they're just saying, if you don't shut up, we are going to muzzle you and we are going to take you out of here. And Bartimaeus, in the darkness, he learned persistence because he knew who it was that was going to be walking in front of him. And he was not going to miss this opportunity for him to just cry out to God. So here's the thing that I love about this story is that, well, actually, this one of my favorite scholars, A.W. Tozer, he says this. He said, we need never shout across the space to an absent God. He is nearer than our own soul, closer than our most secret thoughts. See, I know sometimes in the struggle, we might think that God just isn't there, that he's not listening to our cries, and, that we're just going it alone. And I want you to know today that God is close to the brokenhearted. The next verse that we have here is Jesus. Now, we got to remember in this story, Jesus is coming into Jericho. Not only is he coming into Jericho, but this is the last time that Jesus will ever pass through this place. He is on his way to the cross, on his way to the Passover. And now Jesus, we understand that Jesus is fully, fully God, but he's also fully man. And so as he's walking now, being the fully man, I'm thinking that Jesus is just dreading that day on the cross. He knows what's up ahead of him. He knows the will of God for his life, but he can't help but feel that fear. He knows that he's going to be tortured and persecuted, but then it's the Jesus that is fully God. And as he's walking into Jericho and getting ready to go into Jerusalem, which, by the way, wasn't an easy task. For him, it was another 11-mile journey, like 8 or 9 hours. I mean, think of all that Jesus was going through. And yet Jesus hears this man, and he's calling out to him, and he hears the faith of one throughout the crowds. There were multitudes there, but he hears the faith of this one man, and he's saying, Jesus, Son of Man, Son of David, Son of David, like, have mercy on me. And Jesus says to his disciples, he says right here in Mark 10:49, Jesus stopped him and he said, call him. And so they went over to the blind man and they called him and they said, hey, be of good cheer. Just be of good cheer. Jesus is calling you. And Bartimaeus, he's just so thrilled, like he's not going to wait, right? And he takes his cloak that's over him and he throws it off and he runs to Jesus. You see, here's the value in this. Is that cloak? That was all he owned. That was his prized possession. That's what would keep him warm at night, or when he would beg, that it would be sprawled out in front of him. So if a few coins came that way, that it was there, that, he'd be able to catch them and not being able to go look for them. But yet Jesus called him, and as soon as he heard that voice, he just threw off that cloak and he ran to his Father. And what I love about Bartimaeus is this, or even us, when he gets to Jesus, he's standing right in front of him and he doesn't realize that he's this far. But he hears the voice of Jesus, and Jesus says to him in Mark 10:51, he says this, he said, what do you want me to do for you? And I know that some of you here are just really weighed down heavy with some hurt and pain. And I know that some of you here have just lost loved ones, and that grief is just really fresh, and it's hard and it hurts. And I know that there's some moms in here that are single, and listen, I had my grandkids for about a week, and my hat's off to you. Because it is not easy, but yet you're doing everything you can just to get through another day. And I know some of you here, your marriage is on end, or your finances are really just difficult. And God is saying to you in the darkness, what is it that you want me to do for you? Some of us today need to get on our knees and just ask God, Lord, I have been trying to do this on my own, and I don't want to do it on my own anymore. And so, God, this is what I need. And Jesus here, he's asking Bartimaeus. He said, what do you want me to do for you? And Jesus knew exactly what Bartimaeus needed. And so Bartimaeus, he's standing there, and all of a sudden his faith is going to be made sight, because he's standing in front of Jesus, but he did not waver, because his faith in Christ is so strong now because of the darkness that he was in. He didn't ask for a house. He didn't ask for the Ferrari. He didn't ask for his refrigerator to be full or a seeing eye dog. What he asked Jesus is this. He said, Rabbi, I want to see. And the first thing that he saw when he opened his eyes was the face of God. Jesus said to him, he said, go, your faith has healed you. And immediately, with that one word from Jesus, his sight was made faith. His sight was, he was healed. Let's just say he was healed. Okay, I'm just struggling up here today. Just please pray for me. But anyway, the greatest treasure that we will ever find is found in darkness, and but in the weight of the grief and the pain, God gives us the ability to be able to live fully and freely in Him. The last treasure that we're going to talk about today is peace. And it's a peace that God gives us that is a peace that we cannot understand, like why we feel this way. Right before I had to go in for surgery, most of you know that I had stage 3 breast cancer. And I knew that I had to go in for surgery, and that was weighing on my heart. But in the meantime, I had had lunch with some friends from Ocean State Baptist Church, and we went out to eat, and we were sitting there, and we were, just having a really good time. And they said to me, actually, we were talking about all the pink that you get, because when you have breast cancer, people will send you pink all the time, and it's always this bubblegum pink, And every day that I would see the UPS truck show up, I was like, oh no, I was really thankful for the gifts and for the love and everything, but I would open up this package and I'd be like, oh no, like the pink hats, the pink boas, pink scarves, pink pens. I saw so much pink, and I just was like, this bubblegum pink, I can't do it anymore. And so we're talking to the girls, we're in there having lunch, and we're talking about this because another gal also had breast cancer, and she's like, yeah, doesn't it drive you crazy? I'm, yes, I hate bubblegum pink. And then all of a sudden, we had a really good time when we were talking about it, and we went out to the car, and we do what girls do, and we hugged it out, and they said to me, oh, Gail, hold on just a second. And they said, we have this gift for you. And so they go over to the car, and they come back with this bag, and it's this big bag, and I open it up. I'm like, what could be in here? And I pull it out, and it's this handmade quilt. And it is absolutely beautiful. And it was bubblegum pink. But a few days before, the day before that I was going in for surgery, this was major surgery, and I was a little nervous. I had too many nurse friends, and they tell you what's going to happen when you're under, and blah, 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 blah. And I was fearful. I was afraid. And I took out that quilt, and I put it over me from my toes all the way up to my neck. And I knew that God had used those women of God to pray over that quilt. And the peace that I felt that night, I slept like a baby. You see, here's what God tells us in His Word. He says, you will keep in perfect and constant peace the one whose mind is stayed on Him, or stayed on you. That is being committed and focused on you in both inclination and in character, because he trusts in you. You see, the peace or the treasure that we find in darkness is this peace. But it's not a peace like, oh, peace, be on your way. But it's a perfect peace. God didn't stop at peace, but he gave us that perfect peace in order to go through all of these trials. And I did. I slept like a baby that night. Years after, just a few years ago, I went back to the river where Aaron lost his life. And I stood there and I looked out, and the mountains were just grand, and they were glorious. And the river was just running, and it was beautiful, and the sun just shone off the river. And I looked around, and everything had remained the same, except everything in me had changed. Because that's what God does in the darkness, is he makes us strong. He gives us the ability to be able to stand up under pressure. And my heart for you today is that you will look to Jesus in the darkness and in the despair. Listen, the greatest treasure that we will ever acquire in life will always be found in grief. The last verse that I wanted to share with you today is this. It's Romans 8:18. And it says this, for I consider, and that is from a standpoint of faith. Now we know that he's talking about persecuted Christians, but he's also talking about us here today living in this sin-stained world. And he says this, he said, for I consider that the sufferings of this present life are not to be compared with the glory that is about to be revealed in us, to us, and in us. That verse offers us hope. Friends, listen, I know that we are struggling in ways that we don't want to be struggling in right now, but this isn't our home. And what we suffer here today cannot compare to the glories of heaven. Amen? Thanks for putting up with me today. Thanks, babe.
Well, I hope that Gail was an encouragement to you. I know she's someone that in my life, she's been an encouragement time and time again. And our hope is that she would be an encouragement to you in this time as well. What I want to do right now is walk you through a couple of steps that we can take what Gail had to share with us and put it into very practical ways. And so here's the first one. It says that I want to see that God has more for me than my current situation. And this week, I will call out to Jesus asking for his grace and mercy. So what I'm going to ask you to do is take out that connection card. If this is you, let us know. And here's why. In that story of Bartimaeus, what did we see? We saw Bartimaeus called out to Jesus. And a lot of times, what we do in our grief and in our sadness, and I'm not saying this to be rude, but we kind of wallow in it sometimes. We kind of wait for God to show up. Bartimaeus didn't wait for God to show up. He called out to him. And what we're asking you to do, if that's where you're at right now, will you just say, this week, I'm going to call out to you, God, like I've never done before. And then you heard Gail talk about how Bartimaeus was rebuked. He was admonished. But what did he do? He called out again. It didn't matter. And so that's what we're asking you to do. Will you have that kind of perseverance where you can just keep calling out to God in the midst of your grief? Will you take that step this week? And if you do, please let us know, because we want to be praying for you like crazy as you deal through and work through what you're going through. Here's our other next step. It says that I'm having a hard time finding the treasures in my grief because I have yet to fully surrender to God. And today, I'm choosing to live a completely surrendered life. What did Bartimaeus do? He left his coat behind. He surrendered everything that he had back to God. And a lot of times in our grief, that's the most difficult thing is we're waiting for everything to come right for us. But sometimes we're unwilling or just not ready to take the steps that we need to give something up of ourselves because we feel like we've lost so much already. But can you do like Bartimaeus did? Can you do like Gail had to do and just give of herself? And can you live that surrendered life for Jesus? Would you take that step this week? Again, let us know so that way we can be praying for you. That way we can come alongside you in this.